Welcome back. This next strophe, verses 7 through 9, describes the submission of the servant. First, submitting to unjust suffering without protest. Verse 7, the servant's response is compared to a sheep, a metaphor that's exceedingly familiar to his audience. And the metaphor, I think, evokes in the mind of the reader here thoughts of the sacrificial system as well. In both situations, the animal doesn't protest. Now, a sheep does have vocal ability, which is used to express hunger or when playing, but not to express pain. The most one hears is a groan. Now, the Gospels record how John appropriates this connection. Here is the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world, and explicate how completely Jesus fulfilled this prophecy. He groaned and pled to the Father, but he responded to Herod and Caiaphas and Pilate and the mob without a word of protest. Verse 8, the submission of the servant in his death. The grammar and the syntax of this verse has provided a great deal of homework for translators and commentators, but the point that the prophet is making is that the treatment of the servant was unjust throughout. From the gospel biographies, we learn that the servant was hurried through 5 or 6 trials in one morning, ultimately taken to his death. So, while Isaiah warns of coming judgment, he holds out confidence that a righteous remnant will be preserved. While Isaiah foretells that judgment will come to the nation, he never presents it as unfair or unjust. So, it's difficult to understand that Isaiah might have been speaking here about the nation. Now, the Hebrew text behind the second line in English can be taken to mean, who can talk about his posterity, or among his contemporaries who thought. My take is that it's the latter. The sad thing is that of his contemporaries, very few reflected on either the worth of the servant, or on his character, or on the injustice of his treatment, or on the real purpose of his mission. Remember, John said it was to take away the sin of the world. So, he was cut off from the land of the living. Why? On the account of the rebellion, the pesha of my people, to whom the blow was due. Variations in English translations of this last clause is because the lamo is ambiguous. It can serve as a poetic alternative for either lo, to him, and it is used that way, or for lahem, to them, used 50 times that way. Either reading, I think, renders basically the same sense. Because of the rebellion of my people, to whom the blow was due. Or, because of the rebellion of my people, the blow was his. The focus is on the claim that the cause of his suffering and death was outside the servant himself. His death was vicarious. His death was standing in for the sake of others, who indeed deserved the blow. Verse 9, the submission of the servant in his burial. The challenge in this verse is to interpret the parallelism. Specifically, does the author intend to equate, so synonymous parallelism, or contrast, antithetic parallelism, the wicked and the rich? I think the context points to the evil intent of the servant's antagonists. Remember, they regarded him as a sinner, so they treat him as a sinner. They execute him as a sinner, and so it follows they intend to inter him as a sinner. The singular ashir wealthy person, is in deliberate contrast to the Reshaim, the wicked people. And it's true, the singular could function as a collective, the rich, but the only extant examples are when it's paired with another singular. So the rich and the poor, or the wise and the powerful. The language here seems to contrast a group of evil people and a wealthy individual. Matthew's description of Joseph from Arimathea, chapter 27, a rich man who had become a disciple, could well be an allusion to this text. Then Isaiah uses the disjunctive but or yet to point his audience to divine providence. He tells us that the reason for God's overruling the antagonist's intention was that he had done no violence, nor was there any deceit in his mouth. Well, before we move on to the grand finale in 10, 11, and 12, let me share some bibliography that has upended my reading of the text and really revolutionized my readings of the gospel narratives, the passion of the Messiah. My point is that for many of us, really, the cross is a piece of furniture. We have a handsome one hanging in classroom 201, St. Paul campus. Many of our churches have one hanging somewhere, usually up front. Or else it's a piece of jewelry. And for the vast majority of us Protestants, it's a blank cross, not a crucifix. I understand that it's expressing that Christ was taken off the cross and entombed, and the grave couldn't hold him. He's risen indeed. I think, though, that on the practical level, many of us have so tidied up the cross, we've so upholstered over the horror of it, that it really doesn't grip us anymore. But Isaiah's vision and the disciples' eyewitness accounts paint a very different picture. I think the Passion of the Christ cinema came close to capturing it. So, some bibliographic notes. Some years ago, my research led me to an article by C.T. Davis in the journal Arizona Medicine, entitled The Crucifixion of Jesus. And then in the course of researching another project, I came to Edwards' article on the physical death of Jesus Christ, published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, 1986. And then the Holobeck's Execution by Crucifixion in the Journal of Medicine, 1995. Why I think this is important is that I'm convinced that it's just impossible to stand at the foot of the cross and hold a light view, a flippant attitude towards sin. Think about it. We'll see in a bit.